welcome to this week's lesson for our Sacrament series. Welcome back. I feel like we haven't had one of these videos in a long time just because we had different things going on like Easter and preparing for First Confession. So happy to be back talking to you all again. I hope you all had an awesome Easter. And by the time you're seeing this, for those of you who are receiving your First Confessions, wonderful First Confession. I hope that it went well. Yeah, I'm really excited for you as you get ready for your First Communion, for those of you who are preparing for that sacrament. But today we're going to be talking about a different sacrament, and that is the sacrament of marriage, or holy matrimony. That's just kind of a fancy way of saying marriage. But this is I think this is the fifth sacrament we've talked about. So we talked about baptism, we talked about reconciliation, communion, confirmation, and now marriage. So out of all the sacraments, this might be the one that you're most familiar with because we hear about marriage and we see marriages all the time. You probably know people who are married. I'm sure you've met married people before. We see marriages and weddings on TV and movies. So it's just something that most people are familiar with. Maybe you've even thought about, someday if you get married, what would that be like? Maybe if you're a girl, you think about what kind of dress you'd wear. I don't know if boys think about that as much. Maybe you have if you're a boy. But it's just something that we're all familiar with. So today we're going to be talking not just about weddings, not just about any marriage. We're going to be talking in particular about a Catholic marriage, which is a sacrament, which is why we're going to be talking about it in our sacrament series. And a little fun fact about me is I'm actually getting ready to get married this summer. So right now, me and my fiance, Christian, are preparing for the sacrament of marriage. So I feel like I've learned a good amount about this sacrament in the past couple months preparing for it in my own life. So I'm excited to talk about it with you all today. So that's just a little tidbit for you to get to know me a little better. So let's dive into talking about the sacrament of marriage. So first thing, there's a difference between the sacrament of marriage and just marriage in general. So anybody can get married of any religion. So if someone's Jewish or they're Baptist or maybe Muslim, they can get married. So anyone's allowed to get married. But when two Catholics get married, it's something different and really special because it's not just a marriage, it's a sacramental marriage. So it's a sacrament. So that's why we're talking about it in our sacrament series. Does anyone remember what a sacrament is? We've talked about it a couple times during this sacrament series, but do you remember? I'm just going to pause and see if you have an answer. Okay, so the definition of a sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying it's something physical in our world that we can see, touch, feel, just like, in baptism, the water, we can see that, right? But when the water is poured over the baby's head, grace is given and that baby's made a child of God. So it's an outward sign where grace is given. So in the same way, the sacrament of marriage is an outward sign in which grace is given as well. So each of the different sacraments has a different kind of end goal to it, right? So a goal of baptism is the baby becomes a child of God. Or for confirmation, there's a deepening of the Holy Spirit in the person's life, and they get the gifts of the Spirit. So that's the point of those sacraments. And the point of the sacrament of marriage is a union between a man and a woman forever. So it's a union made by God to have a man and a woman joined together to be together forever. And when they marry within the church, God unites their bodies and souls together. So the marriage bond, when two Catholics come together and are married, it's unbreakable because God brings two people together, and what God brings together, we can't separate. So it's a union between man and a woman that is permanent forever, and when they give their bodies and their souls to each other. So like all the sacraments, marriage also has matter and form. Okay, a little review. What is the matter? It's the physical thing, right? The physical part of the sacrament that most of the time we can kind of feel, see, touch. This time it's a little more complicated, but we'll get into that in a minute. And then the form, do you remember what the form is? The form is the words that are said, right? The prayers that make the sacrament take place. So for marriage, the matter, again, it's a little more complicated. The matter is the consent of the couple. So that might be kind of hard to understand, so we're going to break it down. I don't know if you know what consent is, but consent is when someone says yes and they mean it, right? So if you go to your mom and you say, hey mom, can I go have a sleepover with my friends? And she says, okay, yes, you can do that. She's giving her consent. So she's saying yes, fully agreeing that you can do something. Or let's say when someone might say to you, your friend might say to you, hey, will you come over to my house to play? And you say yes, you're giving your consent to that. You're saying yes and you mean it. So in marriage, for a marriage to take place, the couple has to say yes completely and mean it. So when the couple says yes and means it, gives their consent to be married to each other, that's the matter. And the form, the words that are said, are the vows. So when you get married, you make vows to each other. You say, I promise to be true to you in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad. Maybe you've seen that before. Maybe you've been to a wedding or seen it in a movie. When the couple say their vows and say, I do, that is the form. So for a marriage to be a sacrament, there needs to be 4 things that take place that are a part of that marriage. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about these 4 things. If you can remember, the Catechism is a big book with lots of information about our faith that was written by the popes and the bishops that basically just adds on to our faith and tells us a lot of things that are really helpful when living out our faith in our lives. So that's the Catechism. So those 4 things is, for a marriage to be a sacrament, it has to be free, it has to be total, it has to be faithful, and it has to be fruitful. Okay, let's break down what that means. So firstly, it has to be free. So what that means is that the couple has to come freely, as in no one's forcing them. They're doing it from their own free will. So for a marriage to be a sacrament, the couple has to choose to be there. They can't be being forced, right? So if someone is telling them, you have to marry this person, then that doesn't really count because they have to choose it. So they have to come there freely and they're not being forced by anyone. It's their own choice to get married to that person. Next, it has to be total. So total means they have to have a total gift of self. So that means that they have to say to the other person and mean it, that I give myself to you completely. My whole life, my heart, my body, my soul, I give everything to you and I hold nothing back. So that means that they can't say, I give you everything, I'm gonna love you forever, except for on Tuesdays. No, it has to be every day, all the time, from the moment you get married. You give of yourself totally to love that person in every way you can, and to just give of yourself to that person in every way you can. And number 3 is faithful. So that means that when a couple gets married, for it to be a sacrament, they have to promise and mean it to be faithful to each other. So that means that they're only going to be married to and they're only going to love one person for the rest of their life. So they're not going to be married to more than one person. They're not going to be in love with more than one person. They are going to be faithful to that person for the rest of their life. So they have to go into getting married knowing that they're going to be with just this one person for the rest of their lives. And 4th is fruitful. So what does that mean? Does that mean that they're going to eat fruit of strawberries and apples and bananas? No, that's not what it means. Fruitful means that they have to be open to life. So basically, if a couple gets married and God decides to bless them with a baby, To say that a couple is open to life means that they have to happily welcome that baby into their homes and raise it to know and love and serve Jesus. So that's what it means to be fruitful. They have to go into marriage, meaning saying to each other, if God decides to give us a baby, we are going to welcome that baby into the world and raise it to love God. So the sacrament of marriage is not only a sacrament, but it's also a vocation. So I don't know if you've ever heard that word before, vocation, but essentially a vocation means a call. So it's a call and an invitation from God to love Him and serve Him in a particular way in life. So some people, it's their vocation to get married. Actually, most people will probably, that's their vocation. So probably most of you someday will end up getting married. But not everyone's called by God to be married. Some people are called to other vocations. And we'll talk about that more next week when we learn about holy orders and the priesthood. But some people, men are called to be priests. Some girls are called to be nuns. And in that way, you're kind of married to Jesus. You give your whole life to Jesus to serve Him and love Him as a religious sister or a nun. Some men are called to be brothers and monks to serve and love God in that way. And other people are called to be married. So it's just a particular way that God says, this person is going to love me best and love other people and become the best version and the holiest version of themselves in this way. So they might look at you and say, this person's going to become the holiest and happiest and most joyful they can be if they're married. But then he'll look at another person and say, well, this person, they're going to become the happiest and most joyful and the most holy version of themselves they can be if they become a priest. And everybody's different, so everyone's called to different things. But that's the beautiful thing about a vocation, is that God knows you and He knows your heart and what's going to make you happy. So He's going to lead you to the vocation, to the call that is right for you. So marriage is one of those calls. And the end goal of any vocation is to get to heaven and to be a saint, to be with Jesus forever in heaven. So marriage does that in the way that when a Catholic couple gets married, they are meant to lead each other to heaven and to make each other holier. So that's a really beautiful thing, that when two people live out the sacrament of marriage well, they make each other holier and they lead each other to Christ. So they help each other on their journey towards heaven. So that is the goal of the sacrament of marriage. So just like how we end all the videos in our sacrament series, it's time for the saint story. And what's different about this saint story is today we actually have two saints, because, you might have guessed it, these saints are married. They're married to each other. And their names were Saint Louis and Saint Zélie Martin. So Zélie was the girl, Louis was the boy. They're French names, so they might kind of be hard to say. Some people pronounce her name Zélie, but I especially love Saint Zélie because she was actually my confirmation saint. So last time we talked about confirmation and how when you get confirmed, you pick a saint. Well, my saint is Saint Zélie, so another little fun fact. So Saint Zélie and Saint Louis weren't always saints. They were just Zélie and Louis. They grew up in France in the early 20th century, so it was probably about 100 years ago. So it was a while ago, but not too long ago. And funnily enough, they didn't know each other growing up, but they both really wanted to join religious life. So Louis really wanted to be a priest when he was younger, and Zélie really wanted to be a nun. She wanted to be a religious sister. But for different reasons, some of which was just health reasons, they weren't able to join the religious life. So Louis really wanted to be a priest, but the other priest said, I don't think you're called to be a priest. I think you're called to another vocation. And Zélie wanted really to be a nun, but then the other nun said she was kind of sick and they weren't really sure. And they said, I don't think you're called to be a religious sister, to be a nun. I think you're called to another vocation. So they were both really sad about that because they really thought that was what God was calling them to. But sometimes, even when we have our heart really set on something, God has a different, even bigger and better plan for us. And that was the case with Louis and Zélie. So once they both realized that they weren't going to be religious and for their vocation, religious brothers and sisters, they started working. So Zélie became a lace maker, and she was very talented. She would sew beautiful lace pieces of clothing. And Louis was a watchmaker, so he would make little watches that tell the time. And they were both really good at what they did. And one day, they were in the same town, and they were crossing a bridge, and Zélie was going one way, and Louis was going the other way. And as they passed each other on the bridge, first of all, they both thought, wow. Louis thought, that lady is really pretty. And Zélie thought, wow, that man is really handsome. Because, a lot of the times, that's how these things start. But it wasn't only that, because then Zélie heard God's voice in her heart. I don't know if it was necessarily in her ears. I think a lot of times most people don't normally hear God actually in their ears the same way you would hear someone speaking to you right next to you. That happens sometimes. I know for me, it's normally not that way. It's normally just that voice in your heart, and it's kind of hard to explain, but it's a voice inside that told Zélie, she heard the words, "This is the man I have prepared for you." And she knew in that moment, this is who God is calling her to. She was called to marry this man. And as Louis walked by her, he felt that same call in her heart that this was the woman that he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with. So not too long after that, they were able to meet each other. They started talking, and they very quickly fell in love and got married. They didn't want to wait long at all, so they got married very, very quick. And after about a year or so of being married, they started to have some kids. And in the next couple of years, they actually had 9 children, which sadly 4 of them passed away and died when they were either babies or just little kids. So that must have been really, really hard for them. But they just offered up their suffering to God and to Jesus, and he blessed them with even more children, and they ended up having 5 daughters. Wow, that's a lot of daughters, which is pretty cool. So they had 5 daughters, and they had a really wonderful and loving family. They loved each other very much, and they loved God very much, and they loved their daughters very much, and they just had a really joyful and loving family life growing up. And they taught the daughters to love Jesus above everything else, so much so that all 5 of their daughters became nuns, became religious sisters, which is really crazy because they both wanted to be religious priests and nuns when they were single, but then God called them to something different, right? But he kind of has a funny sense of humor because all 5 of their daughters ended up becoming religious. And I think this is a great example of sometimes God answers our prayers in ways that we don't expect. And God is a God full of surprises. So sometimes he surprises us with things like that in our life, that he answers our prayers in a different way than what we expected, but is even better and more beautiful than what we had originally imagined. So one of these 5 daughters actually became a saint as well. And not only did she become a saint, she became a doctor of the church. And a doctor of the church is basically when the church picks certain saints that, wow, this saint was really, really awesome, and they knew a lot. They knew so much about Jesus that they get a special title of a doctor of the church. And their daughter was Saint Therese of Lisieux. You've probably heard of her before, or Saint Therese the Little Flower. I think we have a statue of her in our church. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure we do. But you might have seen statues or pictures of her. She has the nun, she has the nun habit on, she has the veil, and she normally has flowers in her arms, some roses. So Zélie and Louis, they were the parents of Saint Therese the Little Flower, and their yes to each other and their love for each other brought forth even more saints into the world. And that's the goal of marriage, is to love each other, to give your love to each other completely, and from that love, children will come and become holy saints that serve and love God. And in 2015, only about 6 years ago, Pope Francis named Zélie and Louis saints of the Catholic Church, and they are the first married couple in the Catholic Church to ever be canonized together at the same time as a couple. So that is really amazing, and they are a great example of how the vocation of marriage can make each other saints. They can make the couple saints and make saints of their children as well and lead each other to heaven. So that's the story of Saint Zélie and Saint Louis. I hope you enjoyed it, and next week we will talk about our next sacrament. Bye guys.